couple years for me to start to panic about the fact that I didn't have an idea for another novel, and I couldn't even imagine having an idea. And that was a shock to me, just ego wise, because I had always thought I'd written a novel before Nathaniel P. that didn't get published. I had just thought I was the kind of person who always wanted to be a novelist, who had plenty of ideas, plenty of material. I just needed an opportunity. I need someone to give me a chance to express it. So it was disconcerting that suddenly I had that opportunity. I'd published a novel and people were interested in the second novel. And then all of a sudden I was like, I don't know what to write about. I kind of felt as if I'd said everything I had to say about dating and courtship among Brooklyn writer types. And I didn't find that I was that interested in other stories of middle-class people's psychological and romantic problems. Or I couldn't find at least a story that I was interested in. I still found it interesting. I still liked reading other people's books. It's not that I thought there's nothing else to say. I just felt like I didn't have that much else to say. And I started another book that felt a lot like Nathaniel P., but from a woman's perspective. And I just read a chapter of it. And I just had this feeling of like, this is really sad. I'm not moving forward. I'm just going back to something I felt comfortable with. And I just don't think I have that much else to add here. I feel like I'm just going to reprise the same territory from a slightly different perspective, have a few different observations, but it didn't feel urgent to me the way Nathaniel P. did. So I definitely had something of a crisis, but a slow-moving crisis. There wasn't like a moment of freaking out, just sort of over the course of years, I was getting nervous. And that's one of the reasons why I left the city. My husband and I left. I think he was ready to leave the city much more than I was, just in terms of day-to-day life. I loved living in Brooklyn. I like it a lot. I thought we had a fun life. I loved our friends. But my husband was ready to leave, to have a house, to have a little more space. And the reason I agreed, I think, was both because you're in a marriage, you have to compromise. There's two of you. But also I felt like as happy as I am, something is off because I'm not writing fiction and I can't even imagine writing fiction. So maybe a change of location would be good for me in that way. So in 2016, we left Brooklyn. It's kind of a notable year for many reasons. Brexit. For me, my daughter was born, my only child, a daughter. She was born in August of that year. And then 11 weeks later, we had an election here. Donald Trump won. And I feel like many, many people, I was shocked by that and thrown for a loop and felt like it upended many assumptions I had. And I think that directly led to my next novel, which was a novel that a younger version of myself never would have expected to write. But I think after years of not being inspired to write another novel about personal life, but not really having a subject, I feel like, how in the year, like after Trump was elected, there's for a while, like all those New York Times stories about the reporter would go into diners in the heartland and ask people why they voted for Trump, this desire to understand Trump voters. I think as laughable and kind of annoying as that was, to be honest, I think I had a little bit of the same impulse of like, I thought some of my assumptions are wrong. I want to do something. I want to see a little more of the world. I want to get outside of my milieu. And I just decided to get a job. So there's near where I live, there's a boulevard with all the big chain retailers in the area and fast food. And I just started applying for jobs. And to be clear, like I had regular jobs before, but when I was younger, I was a bagger at a grocery store. I worked at Starbucks, and then mostly I was a waitress. So it's not like I never had a regular job, but I had those jobs when I was young and I was doing it for money, and I kind of, whatever was going on in my life, like the job was the boring part, the thing I did to make money, and my real life was college or my social life or whatever else. So when I looked for a job, what I wanted was to pay attention. Like the job was going to be the thing of interest, and I wanted to get to know my coworkers. And I wound up getting a job at a big box store that I'm trying not to name because for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons being is I think that a lot of what I described that goes on there is just not specific to any one store. It's part of a systemic problem. It's not like this particular retailer was worse than the others in terms of how it treated its employees. And sometimes I feel like naming a store can make it seem like they're particularly bad and sort of shift the blame from the system. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. I got a job at a big box store. I was working these sort of crazy hours, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. on the team that unloaded the trucks of new merchandise that came in every day. And I very quickly, after I think just like a week or two, I felt like electrified and sure that I had a subject for a novel. I didn't have a plot, I didn't have characters, I didn't have anything, but I had a setting, because it turns out that a closed big box store in the middle of the night, being with a group of sort of diverse people of just different ages, different genders, different ethnicities, different races, unpacking boxes in this dimly lit store, surrounded by consumer goods, cracking jokes. It's just this incredibly rich setting novelistically. It just was full of comedy and pathos, and I just felt sure I have to write about this. And then I really, really, really liked my coworkers. I felt like they were really cool, really funny. Not every single one, but there's just a basic core group. And I was weirdly drawn to the place. I liked the job. I liked the people. But at the same time, and just as important, what was horrifying was my coworkers' economic lives and economic circumstances. They lived in poverty, and they lived in poverty because they were all part-time. All the jobs at this store, and it's very similar at most other chain retailers, almost all the store level jobs are now part-time. People didn't get enough hours. The hours were variable each week. The hourly pay was pretty low, but I think the hours were even kind of harder to deal with, because at least with low hourly pay, you can plan around that. But with variable hours, you just didn't know if you were going to get assigned only one 4-hour shift the following week, or you'd be asked to work 39 hours. Never more than 39, because the company didn't want to pay overtime. And so my coworkers, many of them didn't have cars. They'd walk or ride bikes to work. And we lived in a hilly, mountainous area, and there's this curvy boulevard with tiny shoulders, and they're walking to work in the middle of the night. And they just lived with constant stress and anxiety about their finances. I mean, just about paying rent, about having enough to eat. And again, I don't want to sound like I thought like it was shocking to see that people who were working in this environment were not wealthy. It wasn't like I came in there expecting that they'd be, driving fancy cars and having like lavish swimming pools, but the degree to which they worked really hard and were just stuck in something that was just in a situation that was impossible economically struck me. And again, mixed with really liking them and thinking they were cool in the setting. And so I started to feel like 5 years had passed by then since Nathaniel P was published, but I was like, this is it. I don't know how I'm going to do it. It seems really hard, but I want to do something that conveys these two things, that conveys the charisma and the fun, and also the incredible injustice and exploitation. So that's what I tried to do in Help Wanted.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack. And I think the first thing I want to talk about is this pressure to publish that writers often feel, maybe more so when a book is successful. This sense of having to follow it up and having to kind of capitalize and keep producing. There might be more pressure felt by somebody who senses that there's a real readership and that there's going to be real coverage than there is for somebody who's sort of out in the wilderness publishing on small presses or something. But, all writers can feel that. And what I will often notice as a reader is when a book lacks a certain, what I would refer to as like a vital life force or an emotional urgency, And it can be very competently written. It often is very
Hmm.
competently written, but there's no blood on the page. Like, it's
Right.
another way I'll phrase it. And I relate very much to that. It's an important, it's maybe the most important thing for any work of art to have, is this sense that, like, you really have something to say urgently, and that there's real emotion in it, and that it means something to you beyond just a paycheck or continued adoration or, maintaining a public profile, whatever it is. And I'm
Hmm.
not saying this is the case for you, but I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's a common experience. And I don't look down my nose at somebody who needs to make a living. You do have, I mean, if you're a writer and that's how you make your living, you have to keep publishing, right? You have to keep making books. But I relate very much to this window of time where you just didn't have something that animated you at that level. And it sounds like you couldn't really produce anything until you did.
Right. Right. I mean, sometimes I wonder, this goes back to what you said. I thought you put it really well about different reasons for people to write. I had wondered during that time when I wasn't writing, is if I had always underestimated how much ego there was in it, and that maybe I had been driven to write the first book because I really wanted to prove something. And then once I felt like I'd proved it, I just didn't have the same impetus. And that was a funny and disheartening thought, because I mean, everyone has ego, but I didn't like to think that that is what had motivated me. But I so relate to what you're saying, because I was fortunate enough not to feel this intense pressure to write another book to make money. Because again, I did get these journalism assignments that were for journalism, pretty well paying. And because that book had been successful, I had like some royalties from foreign countries. It was optioned for film. It never got made into a movie, but for a number of years, I'd get a check every year for the movie, the book not being made into a movie. So I feel like for a number of years, I was doing okay without publishing a book. So it did make it easier for me to kind of set a higher bar of, I'm not gonna do it until I can. And one thing I am a little glad about, although at times I've regretted when things weren't going well, is that I think in the window right after Nathaniel P came out, when it was successful, I feel like that was a time where I could have sold a second book on a very thin proposal and probably gotten decent money for it. And I'm glad I didn't do that. At the time, that made me nervous, because it was like, I don't know what I want to write about. I don't want to get stuck, and I just don't want to have a contract and this pressure. Um, After years, when some of these other sources of income were starting to dry up, at moments I wondered, like, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I should have capitalized when I could have, because now I don't think anyone's going to give me a book contract based on some, dashed off proposal. Um, because so then by the time 2000, when I got to 2018, when I found an idea, by that point, those other sources of income were drying up. The foreign royalties were not coming anymore. Eventually, the option wasn't renewed. So I was starting to feel like, all right, this is it. I've got to either write another book or just pack it up or just call myself something else. Like, I don't want to, nothing seemed more depressing than to be someone who calls myself a novelist, but just isn't even close to writing fiction. I kind of thought what I might do otherwise was teach high school English, but I just felt like I wanted to do something that I could feel meaningful and worthwhile each day. But um, then I found another subject, and that kept me busy for another 5 years.
Okay. So, in some of the critical assessments of Help Wanted that I was reading as I was getting ready to talk with you, there were acknowledgments of the influence of George Eliot on your work. I want to say both of your novels have epigraphs from George Eliot. Is that right?
They
Am I
do. Yeah.
misremembering? All
Nope.
right. And so there's a tradition that these reviews have sort of noted that you seem to be working in, where you're writing social novels. I guess my question for you is that Do you agree with that assessment? And do you feel now that you've found like your way of approaching fiction? And do you think you will repeat this? Not that you'll work in the same cultural space again. Like I can imagine each book would be distinct, but that you would be a quote unquote like ethnographic literary writer who likes to take apart cultures and learn about them and shine a light on them.
Gosh, it's so interesting. I have to, it's unsatisfying if I say I'm not sure. I see, I guess to me, I tend to like novels that are highly peopled, that that I like 19th century novels, and 19th century novels tend to have, you know, a number of distinctly drawn characters. And it's funny because I do like to read autofiction, but I couldn't imagine writing it. I just feel like my skills or interest is not in like looking inward at my own feeling. I mean, I do like to think I'm reflective. I don't want to sound like that, but I don't. Whatever it is that gift that allows people to turn their inward reflections into something artful on the page, that I love, and certainly Ben Lerner or Sheila Heti, this Rachel Cusk. It's not something I just don't have that. But I do think I have an interest in other people. So it's funny. So in my mind, I tend to see it as being about people rather than ethnography. But I have to think about it because I appreciated that review. I thought it was really interesting. It's like maybe the reviewer knows something I don't. You know what I mean? So, but right, like my impulse, how I would describe myself is I like books with multiple characters and they come into conflict, and I like sort of the clash of different people's moral claims or ideas. I just find that exciting and interesting rather than exploring a single character. I guess Nathaniel P did explore a single character at length, but I felt like the drama of it was in his interactions with the women. So um yeah. And even with Nathaniel P, even though it was a single character, the fun of it for me was that he was not me. I think I like books about people who are not me.
I want to talk with you a little bit more about like the nuts and bolts of taking on this job at a big box store, because you're not the typical person to apply for a job there. You were, I think, Ivy League educated. You went to Brown, right?
Yes. And I have to say, I was glad when I applied for the job that I hadn't gone to Harvard or Yale. I think in certain circles, Brown is well known and lauded. When writing Nathaniel P, I was an SAT tutor, and I think I got that job because I'd gone to Brown, and it's an Ivy League school. But it doesn't stand out as much on a job application at a big box store in upstate New York as I think Harvard or Yale would. I mean, it's just the HR manager isn't thinking so much about the Ivy League. I don't think, it's just kind of glancing at an application. At least that's my sense. But when I was looking for jobs, I walked into this big box store. They were actively hiring, which wasn't true at some of the other places I went to. And so someone sort of sent me to the HR manager, and he told me what shift they were hiring for, what team, that they wanted people to do this very early shift of unloading the trucks and putting the merchandise away before the store opened. And he asked if I'd be willing to do that. And I said yes. And I think that's what got me the job, was just willingness to do the hours. But I think I presented as I put on I didn't leave anything out on my application. I put that I had a college degree, but I said I was a mom with a small child looking for a part-time job that I could do while still caring for my daughter, and all that was true. And that's a reason why some people like these hours, because you could make it work with someone else, a partner who had more of a 9 to 5 job coming in hours like 4 to 8. There were coworkers who'd rush home to get there in time so their partner could be at their job at 9. So they didn't think it was that strange. It was a mom with a child. It was unusual that I had a college degree, but but I think the main thing they were on the lookout for was something was more like a criminal record. I kind of once I said I would work the hours, and I think in talking to the HR manager, they thought I seemed like a nice enough, you know, person. The big obstacle, I did have to have a couple interviews with, but the main obstacle was a background check. And on the background check, they were not looking for previous books published. They were looking for a criminal record. So, um,
Which I should say, you have an extensive criminal record, from what I hear.
I, I, I might, but even that wouldn't be disqualifying. And to be clear, which I think is a good thing that it wouldn't be disqualifying. It had possibly been disqualifying, but by 2018, there was, at least in our area, enough of a need for labor that people had had trouble getting jobs a few years earlier. One of my coworkers, like a character in the book, did have a criminal record, and he'd really had trouble finding a legit job for a number of years, and he really, really wanted one. And he was hired the same time I was. So, um, I think it's a good thing that having a criminal record was not disqualifying, because there are a lot of people who have records for various reasons, and that doesn't mean that they don't deserve work like anyone else.
So what was it like for you integrating, coming at this as somebody who's like more of, like you say, Ivy League educated, best-selling novelist, suddenly working at a big box store and like integrating with other coworkers
Mm-hmm.
and getting to know them? Were there parts of it that surprised you? Was it easy to get to know people? Like, what was the reception like once you got the job?
It wasn't easy, I would say, at all. Like, it very quickly, I started to like my coworkers because they were just funny. I liked some of the banter, but whether they liked me was a whole separate matter. And there were ways I didn't realize even at the time that I stood out to them. One of which was just that I had a car, and some of them did have cars. Um, it's a car that in my regular middle class life, I don't think is particularly fancy. It's a 2015 Toyota Prius. So it's not fancy, but it was probably like people noticed it on the parking lot as a newer and nicer car, the kind of car like the air conditioning worked. It can play podcasts because it connects to my phone while driving. Other people's cars were a little older, a little more beaten up. So I think people noticed that much more than I realized, because I don't really pay that much attention to cars. And also I was the one that was new. Everyone else was already like, they noticed the new car in the employee lot. Um, and so, but I don't want to overplay it. I also don't think my coworkers were that interested in me. Like, they had their own lives. I was just a new person. Someone might have like looked up like, car, but it wasn't like I was an object of fascination. Um, but then some of my like earliest attempts, I think, to make friends with them, I don't think they went super well. One of my impulses was that a way to make small talk and conversation would be to kind of be critical, make fun of the store we worked at for its corporate speak or some of the like Byzantine rules and regulations that seemed ridiculous. And I just feel like in my previous experience in office jobs, this was such a normal way for coworkers to interact. But it was interesting. It just didn't seem to go over so well with some of my coworkers. And maybe because they did perceive that something's a little different because of the car. But I think they thought it sounded entitled. They thought I had just walked into the job and then was insulting the place. And they had plenty of criticisms of our employer as well. But I think it didn't go over that well coming from me. I think that sometimes I would complain and they thought I sounded entitled. But the more time I was there, the more like I realized that I kind of tried to adjust my tone. Um, and with time, I became, well, the other thing I had to do is I'm a former smoker, but I really, really liked my coworkers who smoked. We had a break every day together for 15 minutes. And I just decided I had to go outside and smoke with them. And that was not a big sacrifice for me because I love smoking cigarettes, but I quit for like 10 years. But I have to say the cigarette in the morning, it'd be like 6 a.m. The sun would be, it, yeah, let me try to think. Yeah, 40. It's often about 6 a.m. The sun would have just risen or be rising, and we'd have a cup of coffee and just sort of, not instant coffee, but, coffee from a drip coffee maker, like Folgers coffee, and a cigarette. And we'd have sort of done 2 hours of kind of hard work. It just, it felt so good, that coffee, that cigarette, the dawn. And that's where I really made friends, is just hanging out outside. Um, and the thing I just want to keep underlining is it's not that I didn't expect to like my coworkers, but I really liked them. We had an annoying boss, and some of them would just be so funny in the ways they would imitate her and make fun of her. It just felt like high school. I just felt like these were the cool kids and I wanted them to like me. Um, and, even though I'm not that funny and, in that sort of way. But I think eventually, with just persistent trying to be nice, like I feel like we did become friends, and that meant a lot to me. And then, as we became better friends, eventually, I told them that I was a writer, because it started to feel like I was withholding vital information. So that was then a new phase in our relationship.
So, okay, I want to know, like you mentioned earlier, that like a week into the job, you had this kind of electric creative experience where you realized you had a subject for your second novel. Did you go into the job at this box store thinking like maybe I can find a project in this? And then once you, and if not, once you had that sort of revelation a week into it, did your time at work take on, it had to have taken on like a new air for you where you're like, I'm researching here. Like this is
Hmm.
copy.
Right. I did go in hoping that it would inspire something. I didn't know what, but I just thought it would have to be a good thing to just broaden my experience. I thought that maybe it would just trigger thoughts in my own mind, or, I just meet someone who had this crazy experience, and then I would ask them if I could fictionalize it or just inspire something. I just thought it would be like, I mean, I went into it with the hopes that it would somehow help with this desire for to find something to write about. But what I didn't expect is that the workplace itself would be what I found so, exciting and electrifying. I found just quickly that I wanted to write something set at a store like this one. And then, to my surprise and sometimes irritation, I really wanted to write a novel with a group protagonist, because I felt like what I really liked, one of the things that made it really compelling for me and pleasurable, and also just intellectually interesting, was the group dynamic. It was, I sort of felt like writing a conventional novel with the one character at the center that usually has sort of personal drama as the main driver of plot. It just didn't feel like it was going to be a way to convey some of what I found most interesting and exciting about being there. So that came as a surprise to me, that I felt like I found a subject, but it was a subject that was going to be a little complicated. It was just kind of like, okay, this is not going to be really easy to conceive and write, because, just having a group protagonist and just figuring out a plot for the book was really hard, and trying to write a book with many characters and do it in a way that readers could keep them straight was very hard. But, um, I don't know, that was the thing, like that. I just, like, that's what I had to do, because that was where it felt like as you put it, like where the blood was. That's what I wanted to write about. So it's like, oh shit, I guess I gotta figure out a way to do this complicated task.
So were you taking notes at work? Like or was it something where you went at home at night and then wrote stuff down, or were you jotting things into your phone? And did you have any misgivings about interactions with coworkers where maybe before they knew that you were a writer, you might have been observing them in like an ethnographic way or something without their knowledge. Do you know what I'm saying? Was there any
Yeah.
ethical issue
Mhm.
there?
Oh my gosh, so many. I mean, it just really started to weigh on me before I told them, because in the beginning, when I didn't have any friends, it didn't seem to matter. But in that middle phase, when I felt like we were becoming friends, um, I knew what I wanted to do was fiction. It wasn't going to be nonfiction. So there's something freeing there. No one was going to be um, written about by name or in a recognizable way, but it just still felt like an ethical quagmire. It began to weigh on me that I needed to tell these people so that they wouldn't feel betrayed, because it just it felt important. So I was very glad to do that, and to my surprise, it just went over really well. It was it's so unexpected. Like, I feel like you're in LA, right? And I feel like
Hmm.
LA, like Brooklyn, full of writers. Look, if we went to a group of people in either of these places that we've been hanging out with and said, like, oh, I've decided I'm going to write a novel all about like our little scene over here, I feel like they'd probably be pissed off, annoyed, not like the idea. But I think for my coworkers, it was so unexpected. They we were at a bar together, which isn't something we often did for financial reasons. But I had told people it was the 2018 midterms election, the day of the 2018 midterm elections, and I told people that if they voted, I would buy them a drink. And everyone knew I was very into voting. They thought it was kind of dorky and cute, but I brought voter registration forms. I'd given people rides to vote who didn't have cars. But so it was like in my character. And so then we're at the bar, and I told them, and one of them got on his phone and looked up my name and found The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P. And then they were just shocked. They're like, wait, you're not joking? Like, you've really written a book and you want to write another? But they were really supportive and really nice. I mean, again, I think it wasn't something they had any negative preconceptions about, because it just wasn't part of their day-to-day experience. And they sort of were flattered and thought it was cool, and have been, very, very kind and supportive. I recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that came from my experience at the store, and sort of arguing that the system in which workers are only hired to work part-time and have no regular hours is kind of unsustainable and unconscionable. And I drew on my experience at the store. And then the fact checker, like the day before it's going to be published, I mentioned that I had a coworker who lost his health insurance because he hadn't worked enough hours to qualify, even though he'd been at the store for years and he previously had it. And even though he'd begged for more hours, but he didn't meet the threshold of 25 hours a week for a calendar year. So he got kicked off the company health insurance. And I think my editor had thought, because I didn't name the store or put anyone's name and this wasn't illegal, that it wouldn't really need to be verified. But then, as it was going to be published, the checker was like, no, we can't print this without verifying it. So I had to call up my old coworker who I'd been in touch with, but I had to be like, hey, do you mind talking to this guy from the New York Times, like, in the next half hour, and confirming the story that's also like a little personal. It's not so fun to be like, yeah, I lost my health insurance. And he did. And I just, I really appreciated that. Like, it was just a really, I feel like they've been really generous with me. I hope I'm gonna, I hope it's mutual. I really like them a lot, but yeah.
So I'm wondering, did the big box store that you worked in stock books? And if so, did it stock your book?
My first book? Well,
Yeah.
no one stocked my first book by then, except maybe a couple stores in Brooklyn or something, or LA. So, and especially like the big box stores only have, current bestsellers. So it wasn't there. So I didn't have to worry about that. I think it's on the website maybe, but everything's on the website. Um, yeah. So whether it will stock the new one, I guess, is an open question. But
Yeah. That would be cool if they did. That would be,
Yeah.
to see help wanted inside a big box store would be some kind of like odd triumph, I think.
Right. And I feel like I could be wrong. I really don't pretend to know how the book buying part of the big box stores operations operate. I was at a very low level, but I sort of feel like they're not really paying attention to the content. It's sort of about the sales. So it could wind up on the shelves, but just because no one actually noticed, it was a critique of the actual store.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like if it sells, it sells. That's all that matters.
Right.
So I want to ask you about the plot of the novel itself. We've kind of talked about all that went into its creation or the lead up to its creation. But in terms of the innards of your book, you've got a fictional big box store called Town Square, which is based on your experiences at the unnamed big box store where you actually worked. And you are writing a polyphonic novel about a team, essentially, of employees who work in a way within this big box store that most consumers don't have a frame of reference for. Like, that's one of the thrills of reading this book, is that you get to learn how the sausage gets made. It's also kind of a horror. There's a
Hmm.
sadness to learning about how difficult this work is and how unsung and underpaid and without benefits and all the systemic things that sort of keep people in like working poverty,
Hmm.
essentially. But the book centers on a team of people known within this town square store as Team Movement, which is like vaguely digestive. I think it was like formerly team logistics, right? And then they
That's right.
switched it to Team Movement. And can you just describe what Team Movement's responsibilities are within the store?
Right. So the team comes in to unload the trucks of new merchandise that arrive at the store several times a week, depending on how busy the store is. Um, the merchandise comes from a distribution center, of which there are multiple spread throughout the country, and it's to replace stock that what's been sold, or to have new items for the new season. So our team would unload the trucks, just first get all the boxes and all the merchandise off the truck, sort of sorted into pallets by type. And then that was the first part of our job. Then the rest of our shift was taking the pallets of boxes out of the warehouse and putting the items on the shelves in their actual places. And if you think about it, if you think about like how hard it is to move from one house to another and how long it takes to unpack and set up a new house, and a big box store is like the size of several football fields, I think. Sorry, I could be getting that wrong. I'm forgetting the measurements, but like 150,000
They're
square
big.
feet, something. They're big. And there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
It's like these trucks are big. They're bigger than most moving vans. I think um it's like it's like moving several McMansions every morning and getting all the stuff put away. It's a lot. And so that was our job. Again, I didn't know anything about this before I took the job, and I took it only because the hours, I thought they would just work well with I wanted a job. The hours for some reason appealed to me, and then I learned all about this. But I also
And
realized just
just
how.
just so we don't lose people,
Mhm.
uh, when you talk about the hours, you're talking about what, like a 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. shift? Like, this is when
4
the
a.m.
unpacking happens.
Yes. So because the idea is you want to get the items on the shelves before the store opens at 8. And at at um at times the hours would change. Sometimes they'd be 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And the reason to do that is the second half of our shift, the store would be open and customers would be there. But that would mean we were available to answer customers' questions because, as you know, sometimes when you go to a big box store, it's hard to find something and it's hard to find employees to help you. So they liked the idea of us working while customers were there so we could help customers. But it was also slower to work when customers were there. You have to work more carefully and more neatly if the store is open. You can't like leave like flatten, throw your empty boxes into the aisle and just worry about throwing them out and flattening them later. Like if customers are there, you want to do it in a neat and orderly way that is just less efficient. So our hours would change like intermittently between 6 a.m. to 4 a.m. That was probably the first thing I mentioned earlier that I sounded entitled to my coworkers at first. And this is why I'd been hired. I think I thought the hours were going to be 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And after about a week or even a few days, your boss was like, oh, we're getting really behind. We're going to just move to 4 a.m. tomorrow. Is that okay? And everyone said yes. And I was like, what? I like 6 a.m. was early enough for me. Like I was shocked that we would be asked to change our hours so dramatically, the drop of a hat. But I was the only one who was shocked. And when everyone else went along, I was like, well, I guess I better go along too. So yeah.
So 4 a.m. That's an early time to have to start work.
It is. And at the time, my daughter was like a little over a year, and I was still nursing her. So I'd set my alarm for 2:30, nurse her for about half an hour, then take a shower and get out the door by like 3:35 or so. Another thing that surprised me is everybody gathered in the employee area where the time clocks were before the shift started. Not only were people not late, but everyone was early. The idea was to be there by 5 minutes before the shift started because you're allowed to clock in then. You could start getting paid. And so the culture was just that people would get there 10 minutes before to just put their stuff away and be ready to clock in as soon as our shift started. And it just like it contradicted all these ideas that I think the wider culture had, the people, workers at stores like these being sort of irresponsible and shiftless and high turnover. It couldn't have been more, people couldn't have been more serious about the job and professional in that sense. But yeah, so early hours.
I mean, yeah, and the people, at least in the book, I don't know if this was the case in your actual work experience, team movement, these like unpackers, the unloading the boxes and then distributing the product to the sales floor were referred to as roaches because they show up overnight and then kind of scatter, in the light of day. Is that a term that you borrowed from real life?
I did. It was I'm trying to think of who said it, but again, my coworkers were so funny. It didn't surprise me, but I think it was the brother of a coworker who had also had our job years before, but was no longer there. But I think he was described to me as the author of the term, but we all thought it was sort of darkly funny and just really apt. So it wasn't like to be clear, like corporate called us that in the contemptuous way. It was more like something we called ourselves with like a sort of dark pride. I just thought it was such a funny and apt way of describing us.
Sure. And when I think you described the diversity of team movement in the book as something that would be the envy. Am I getting this right? The envy of any elite private school headmaster. Like
Yeah.
there's a wonderful diversity to the cast of characters that you've created in your novel that I think hews to your lived experience. And as I imagine it, I would think that would probably be the case. Like people who work in these jobs are maybe not as uniform in their makeup, their cultural background, their ethnic background, their upbringing, whatever it is, as you might find in, say, a New York publishing house, where a
Right.
lot of the people sort of hit the same markers, right? Like, was that the case? It's the case in your novel, but was it also
Mm-hmm.
the case for you experientially?
Oh, very much so. And I really wanted to capture that because it was just so striking that sense of yeah, yeah, this diversity that we, in so much of elite culture is fetishized, or I mean, I don't say that derogatively, but sought after. Just like you want to find it, just come to a place like this. I mean, and some of it is going to reflect the area, of course. It just turns out, I think our area has um, some of everything. I'm in a somewhat of a rural area, but there's an urban center, and I think probably compared to many parts of the country, there are fewer immigrants and our county than in others, but there were plenty, and you just saw all of it. Just black, white, Hispanic, native born immigrants, um, people who are gay, people who are straight. And to the credit, I think of this company, I want to give them credit. They were very careful in their language about race in terms of and gender and sexual orientation, and just careful to convey an attitude of inclusiveness and welcome. And and I think that actually meant something to some of my coworkers who had worked at places where there might have been more of a climate of racism, or of being less friendly to gay people. And so it's funny because it's easy to say, like, well, it didn't cost the company anything, and it didn't make up for the low wages, which were the worst problem that everyone had. But I think that there was a sense of appreciating its sort of progressive values in that way. And it had a very, like, no tolerance for sexual harassment, which was something I think some of my coworkers appreciated because they'd worked in environments where that was not the case. So, yeah.
Well, there is, despite all of these kind of safeguards, like kind of corporate policies and processes that I think are increasingly common, especially in like bigger corporations where you have like training and HR processes for reporting infractions and so on and so forth. That doesn't, at least in the world of your novel, mean that there were not like issues around race, like in the workplace. Like I think some of the ways that you depict characters who are African American or of color versus the ones who are white or who have like a college degree, like there were some really inherent biases in terms of how these workers were treated, and in particular how they were evaluated for their potential to advance within the company.
Yeah. I mean, I think I tried to be careful in the book. I didn't want to make it too overt because I don't think that was generally the rule. I think there may be particular people and characters who were not aware of their biases, or maybe were aware and didn't care. Um, but I think some of it was just that, like, the company's blind spots of this sense of what the HR people thought was made someone seem worthy of promotion, of being was uh, coming off as responsible or intelligent, was really just having a kind of middle class vibe, and that that was troubling. It was like that, having that kind of presentation went a long way, but it really had nothing to do with your skill at the job or your work ethic or anything that mattered really. Just sort of having certain cultural references.
Well, I
And
mean, I think like the girl boss character, Meredith, who is at the heart of the plot of this novel, when there is some personnel shifts happening within town square and the opportunity for advancement arises, and there's sort of a competition that unfolds
mhm.
to get a promotion essentially. And you talk about certain people presenting as middle class and this being in their favor when it comes to potential for advancement. I want to say it was like Meredith vacationed at Lake Placid instead of Lake George. So there's these little kind of signals that might work in someone's favor because it is commonly, I don't know that region, so I don't know the difference between Lake Placid and Lake George, but it's the kind
to
of
be
thing that someone
honest,
might recognize.
I'm not sure that the reviewer had that exactly right. I mean, maybe she does, and I'm wrong. But as far as I could tell, there's not that big a difference between Lake Placid and Lake George, both of which are
Okay.
these
I
towns
was
in
like,
my area.
maybe
But
there is.
Yeah, no, it's so funny because I read that and I was like, huh. I mean, Lake Placid sounds kind of classier because the word placid, but my sense, I mean, she didn't pull it out of nowhere because a character expresses some of that, but I kind of about the two places in a very throwaway way. But I didn't find I didn't mean to imply that the character was reliable. You know what I mean? Like the character said something about like, oh, I don't go to Lake George, I go to Lake Placid. But I thought she was just kind of expressing some idiosyncratic preference. I didn't see that as representative of like, oh, anyone in the New York area really understands Lake Placid is much classier than Lake George. Um, I think it's anyway. I thought that was funny in the review.
Okay, yeah. See, I don't know. I thought I took
Right,
it at face value. I was like, okay, I guess
right,
maybe the
as one
place to
would.
go is Lake Placid.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we had this conversation. So if you or listeners or viewers go to Lake Placid, they're not. I don't want them to be so disappointed because they're expecting some like really upscale, elegant resort town. It's a lake town in upstate New York. It's got its nice parts, but it's not like I don't know going to St.
Lake
Moritz or
Como.
something. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it's impossible really to kind of spend time going over each of your characters. I think that's something that readers have to kind of experience for themselves. But Meredith is a particular kind of character that we see in stories that I do want to touch upon a little bit more because she's the boss character, right? And
Hmm.
kind of the bad boss, also the girl boss, and ambitious and strategic and pushy. I think to her employees in general, annoying.
Hmm.
uh, I think we've all experienced some version of this, unless I guess we've never had to have a job or something. But everybody who works for a decent amount of time will eventually be confronted with a bad boss in some form, right?
Right.
And so she's, as a creation for you, maybe born out of some experience. But can you just talk a little bit about the choice of that character and that characterization?
Yeah. I hmm. I had fun with her character and her characterization. Um, I don't think I saw her quite as much in the girl boss mode. No, I guess I did. To be fair. But I liked having her have a mix of things where she's kind of half trying to be friends with the employees, but also the other half being a total bitch to them because it's really all about her own ego and her emotional needs at the moment. Like other people barely exist to her as other than props to her. So she's not averse to being friends with the people she manages if being friends just means like they compliment her and tell her nice things and give her like positive reinforcement when she wants it. But at other moments, what she wants more than that is just to alleviate her anxiety about work getting done. And she just yells at them and is quite rude. She's just always whatever suits her needs in the moment. Um, my conception of the book was that there'd be this boss figure who was going to play an important role for comic purposes and also for the sake of realism. Like I just think I wanted to create a workplace that felt real and had these real dynamics. So I feel like having a boss who's hard to deal with was key. It's like such a like fun pleasure in watching The Office, for example. Even though my character is very different from Michael, who ultimately turns out to be lovable. I think in The Office, but I feel like there's just a pleasure in having the bad boss character. But the way I conceive the book is that in some ways she's also kind of a red herring that the workers spend a lot of time hating her and complaining about her and thinking about ways to get her off their backs. But really at a certain point I hope it becomes clear in some narrative way that in fact their bigger problem is the system. It's not Meredith. It maybe it was even a little bit fun to have someone to hate and like a sort of enemy. Um, because I felt like trying to write a novel, or the way I conceive this novel, where the system is the bad guy, it's just kind of a hard thing to dramatize. So I like the idea of having a sort of comic stand-in for that, but because that's just a little more fun. But ultimately, like Meredith can come and go, but it doesn't really get at the bigger problems in the workers' lives, which is the lack of money.
Well, there are so many wonderfully drawn characters. Again, people are going to have to read to meet them all. Um, some of them are like very moving. Like Ruby as a character really got to me. There are elements of Travis that got to me, who is kind of like this almost college athlete. You know, all like this ambition in these people and this desire for a sense of self-worth and this belief in themselves as having some greater purpose, buttressed against the systemic problems, as you put it, of, you know, late capitalism and big box stores and the
Right.
financial realities of that. Just really interesting and moving to read about. But no character in this book got to me more than the Milo character,
Mm.
who is so complex and wonderfully drawn and recognizable in some ways. I've met Milos in
Mm-hmm.
my life and even in my work life, like delivering pizzas. And there's just so much psychological insight into that character. Like he really, I haven't seen him in a book that I can recall, but you just talk a little bit about him, like who he is on the page and like how you went about
Sure.
creating him and his set of concerns.
Sure. No, thank you. I love that. I'm very attached to Milo myself, but I also just really appreciate what you said about some of the other characters because, as an author, you don't know if you're just being um, grandiose. I feel like all of us as Brad, you're a novelist as well. Like we have our moments of like some moments you think you're doing something amazing, and then an hour later you look at the same stuff and you're like it's terrible. But in my more grandiose moments, I sort of felt like of the workers who are sort of featured in the story or main characters. There's about 7 of them. I felt like all their stories were so moving to me. Like I just saw the novel as like there's like 7 deaths of a salesman here. Like each one just has this quietly heartbreaking story. And so I know it's a strange thing to say, but I just feel it's very different for me than my relationship to the characters in Nathaniel P. That were sometimes I wanted to defend them. I didn't think they were as bad as many readers thought, but they're very mockable. They're pretentious. They're ridiculous. They're status oriented. And they have enough privilege that one can and should feel comfortable calling them out for those things. I felt like with this book, I just feel very tenderly toward these characters, not because they are less complicated or because they're not, and I think they're very funny. Their intelligence comes through, even if they're not educated at fancy institutions. Um, so thank you for saying that. It means a lot. So Milo in particular, yeah, I feel like too that like in our culture these past few years, I think the idea of like the incel has come up, and I kind of saw Milo a little bit in that vein. He's got a couple kids. It's not like he's never been with the women, but he feels himself to be. Oh, I should explain. Like he's 39, he's single, he does have 2 kids, but a number of failed relationships where he feels like he's the one who's been dumped and cheated on. What he would like is love in a kind of conventional way, like to be married, to have a family, to feel loved and supported. And he hasn't been able to find that. He's got what one of the other characters in the book called not only no game, but like the opposite of game. He's like a black hole where game goes to die. And that's in part for reasons that I think are relatable. Like he's so self-involved. He's got a sweetness, but he can't get out of his own head. He's always trying to impress like in the course of the book that he falls for a woman, and he just doesn't really listen to her when she talks because he's too busy trying to impress her with his achievements, and he has no idea that he's coming off so much worse than he would if he could just ask her a question and listen to the answer. But in his mind, he's doing it because he's insecure. He wants to prove to her how interesting he is. He already thinks she seems amazing, so she doesn't need to prove anything. But I know, I guess I love these tragedies of misperception and how we misread situations. I think because each of us is so stuck in our own insecurities, we can't really see what other people are seeing. And I felt like Milo gave me a lot of opportunities to play with that. But I also feel very tenderly toward him. He's when I, the word incel has a lot of negative connotations, and I want to be clear. Like Milo is not. This is the character in the book is not like misogynistic. That he's not like angry or maybe he is angry at things. I shouldn't say that, but he's not angry at women generally or a white supremacist. But he's a guy who's just not had good luck with women for reasons that are totally understandable. I feel like if you were a woman in this book, you probably wouldn't fall for him. But I hope readers can also see how hard that is on him. And then he's had a really tough life, as all the characters have had. He just has never had much in terms of love or support. He had his father had left when he was young. He'd never quite gotten over that. His mother had a constant stream of boyfriends and was sort of partying, and a lot of issues related to that. So I don't know. I wanted him to be this complex character who's both very lovable and also the reader totally gets why he'd be very annoying in real life too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the thing about not just him, but all of these characters are compassionately drawn and honored in their humanity and their complexity. And I appreciated that a lot as a reader, because I think in our culture as presently constituted, it could have been easy to just make him like Milo the incel. You know what I'm saying? Like he could have just been like a caricature of like the incel. But instead, I find myself like both annoyed by him, as anyone would be, but also like heartbroken for him, because I learn about his childhood and I learn about the fact that he's always sort of been in a mode where he has to care for others. And he's a guy who so desperately just wants someone to love and care for him and doesn't have that. And then can't see himself clearly enough to be able to maybe correct certain behaviors or attitudes or whatever. And
Right.
it's tragic. Like you said, multiple deaths of a salesman in this kind of chorus of voices and characters that you've created. And even though the book itself is, well plotted and has its moments of levity and humor, there's a kind of great undertow of sadness that I felt reading it. I don't know how you couldn't.
Yeah.
It just feels like there is something systemic that needs to be corrected in terms of how we treat people who work in these unglamorous roles, helping to line the pockets and increase the profits of these giant, very wealthy corporations. And I think that's maybe a good place to end the conversation, is just to talk more about issues around dignity of work, the difficulty of work, both of which I think are portrayed in this book, but also to talk a little bit about some of the larger questions that it raises about the systemic injustices faced by working people who, like you say, have variable hours, don't know what they're going to be earning from week to week, despite the fact that they have families that they're trying to support, but also just the incredible lack of compensation. People are
Right.
maybe, how does anybody survive on minimum wage in this country? It's obscene. So I'm
Right.
sure these are things that are on your mind. I'd love to just hear you talk about like how you conceive of these larger issues in the aftermath of writing and publishing this book.
Yeah. No, I'm thrilled to talk about it because I'm so glad you took that away from the book. For me, working at the store was so eye-opening and disturbing for all these reasons, and I wanted the book to capture that. And it was tricky because I also wanted it to have some levity, to be funny, because I wanted people to read it. And I just sort of feel like if you write a book that's just all doom and gloom, it might not have the effect you want, because unfortunately that's I don't exclude myself in this. I'm often apt to put off reading books that seem like they're just going to be heavy. And I felt like I wanted to make the book appealing. I also again, wanted to be true to the people I worked with who were funny, and I don't want to. I didn't think it would be right to just portray these characters as only victims of economic circumstance, because that's not the entirety of who they are. But on the other point, but it also is very, very important to me to have the takeaway that I think we should all feel sick about the injustice. I mean, and by we all, I think most of us who are in a more privileged or middle class or upper middle class, let alone wealthy environment, I want it to give all of us real pause. I think that our culture has a lot of we're we try to tell ourselves a lot of things to make ourselves feel better about injustice, such as the people who work these sorts of jobs, that if they're stuck in them, it's probably because they're not reliable, or they have some mental problems, or issues with addiction, and that's very sad. But there's not that much that can be done other than maybe some, adding to more generous welfare benefits. But I think that's just a lie. I think that our country's full of extremely hardworking people, and people who do jobs that just a generation or two ago were not so low paid. That this is a new thing. The sort of the destruction of the sort of post New Deal era, where I think during the New Deal you had Fair Labor Standards Act and many other pieces of legislation that created the middle class society of the 1950s, 1960s, where it was for a while, not for everyone in the United States, and it's certainly certain groups were excluded, and racism was a huge issue, but there, a large swath of Americans were able to just work relatively simple jobs and earn a living wage and have a decent life. And we've lost that. And it wasn't like we lost it by accident. I think we lost it through kind of allowing things to atrophy, that this issue, for example, of people only working part-time. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 is the act that established the 40-hour work week. And there, the idea was to prevent employers from overworking employees. So establishing 40 hours is the rule, and then you have to pay overtime if workers go over. So the problem you're trying to curb is overwork. But starting in the 70s, due to like financialization and companies consolidating and then needing to pay dividends to their shareholders and show the business press that they're doing well, there was a desire to save money, and companies started getting this idea of like, well, what if we go the other way? What if we start hiring more part-time workers instead of full-time workers? And it started slowly, really took off, I think, since the year 2000, and it has a lot to do with the rise of Amazon and retailers competing with Amazon and needing to cut their own costs to stay competitive. But I think it's all part of a system where, like the business press, what is valorized is profits, and we don't look at where the profits come from. Like, are you making more because you found ingenious ways to pay your workers less? And I think that's a lot of what's happened. We've taken a system that was more equitable sort of 40 years ago and just found ways to take money from people at the bottom and give it to people at the top. And I think it's underneath a lot of some of the problems we're having now generally. But I think there is a way back, that I think we should have an economy that's based on a living wage for everyone who works. And I think that might mean less for people at the top, but it's a fairer, better way to organize a country. And it's just the right thing to do. And I think it is doable because we had it. We had something closer to it that slowly eroded. I think in the neoliberal era.
It's complicated. I mean, there's a lot of different parts, right? There are a lot of different reasons for why things have degenerated. But one of the statistics that always gets me whenever I'm reading about this sort of thing is executive compensation as a multiple of what the median worker at a particular company makes. And I want to say that, like, in the 1960s, 70s, the average executive compensation was like 30x the median worker. And now it's like 1,000x. Like, the disparity in income between the person at the top and the median worker at the company is so far out of balance that
Right.
it's absurd.
I know it's like it's sickening. I think in some ways I think we like people who are not making 900 times what the median worker is made. We've still gone along with it a little bit because we've been sold this bill of goods about how it's just these forces in the economy that can't be controlled or influenced. They just happen to value people with certain cognitive skills and not others. But I think that's a lie too. It's just a question of how much uh, um, to what extent workers are represented by unions. You know, certain jobs that we now think of as good jobs that have just sort of somehow gone away. They weren't good jobs until the 1930s when they became unionized. To work at a steel mill before the 1930s was a miserable, low-paid job. And then under Roosevelt and the New Deal, there was a lot of encouragement of unionization. For the first time, the federal government was supporting unionization and pushing companies to unionize. And that's what made being a steel worker a good job, like a path to the middle class. Wasn't because there's something inherently productive about it, but because when the workers were able to unionize and unions could demand better pay and benefits. But I think we're now told that just something has happened. It just can't be helped. It just economic forces. This is what they do. But I don't think that's the case. I think that it's about worker power and how much of a role the government plays in ensuring that there's some kind of fair minimum. Yeah, and that's why we get this crazy world where CEOs make 900 times what their median worker makes.
So the answer, I mean, I'm not going to expect you or expect us to solve all of these issues in this podcast, but generally speaking, for people listening, thinking about this stuff, I think where I land, and I suspect where you land when it comes to finding a more equitable way forward, is that it's not about individual workplaces reorganizing themselves or changing their policies, though that can help.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about legislation. It's about changing things systemically, and also it's about changing things systemically and legislatively. Like that's where the real big shifts are probably going to be found, right? And organizationally, like people unionizing and being able to collectively bargain with their employers.
Yeah, that's very much what I think, because I think that it's so much not an issue of one employer being bad or just being punitive or evil, that it's a whole system where each one is responding to incentives that they're competing with others, that if all consumers care about are low prices, if you have higher overhead than your competitors, then you have you have to price things a little bit higher, then you'll lose business. So I think it's very hard for a large company like this to be an ethical employer. And I think one advantage of regulation is it can set an even playing field. You know, it can actually help companies that would like to be more ethical, but they have to compete with others who are not being ethical. And so I think that's a real value of setting a higher bar for everyone. So good players aren't being undercut by those who don't care.
Yeah, and creating like a race to the bottom,
Right.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking with you and loved kind of exploring the world of this novel and getting to learn more about it. And also, like you say, like being entertained by it. Like that's a delicate balance with a book like this that's exploring the terrain that it explores. So credit to you for finding a way to do it, and glad to see you back publishing again. I always end by asking if my guest is working on anything new. I don't know if you're going to take your time again, or are you already do you already have another project in mind? Do you have a sense of it?
Oh my gosh. I feel so unproductive compared to other people. I feel like even though I had to turn in the final manuscript of this, like the page proofs, maybe in August, it still feels like I just finished it. In my mind, I can't even begin to think about anything else. I guess I have been working on an essay um, about sort of post World War II fiction, U.S. fiction, and so that's been good for me. I think for me, I like to go from fiction to literary criticism or journalism a little bit because I don't know, I think I get really like all into a fictional world, and it's just hard to to switch gears. But I always admire people like my friend Josh Ferris, who's, as I think most people would agree, just a brilliant novelist. He can be so productive. It just amazes me, and he's so good. But I think he's able to go from to just create one fictional world after another in a way that I admire, and I don't think I will ever hope to be able to do myself. So I think I'm going to slowly come out of this one, maybe do some criticism, some journalism, but I hope it doesn't take me as long to come up with the next idea.
Listen, I think the more that I talk to a lot of writers, obviously, and I think everybody just has their own way and their own
Yeah.
internal rhythms, and there's no shame in it. I think. I mean, I take longer too, so I can relate entirely. And
Okay.
I
Thank you.
mean, you can't force it. I mean, some people just write faster than others. It's like here's a good comparison. Like certain plants grow fast. Other plants grow very slowly. It doesn't mean there's one plant that's better than another plant. Like, I think,
All right, so you and
you
I
want
are
to
the
be
slow
working.
plants.
That's right. Hey, we got to have some slow plants. There's some beautiful slow plants in this world. So, anyway, it's really nice to talk with you. Congratulations on Help Wanted, and best of luck to you with whatever comes next.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. What you've said has been really meaningful to me, and this has been really a lot of fun. So thank you.